Good afternoon, welcome to the Manchester is Red podcast from the Manchester Evening News. Myself, Tyrone Marshall, hosting today. Only two of us on. Samuel Luckhurst just back from Seville, ahead of going back to Seville in a few weeks' time. United making a habit of being in Seville this season, having been there in December as well. In their World Cup friendly. So we'll touch on that Real Betis game to start with. Samuel, your journey back this morning sounded like it was relatively stress-free. And what did you make of that game last night?
It was, apart from what the Brexiteers have inflicted on us with the passport control queues at Malaga Airport. But fortunately, we didn't miss our flight at all. We were allowed in at the front. But going on to matters of greater interest to United supporters, it was very professionally done. Apart from the first 15 minutes, which were pretty frantic, and I didn't really get what United were playing at, really. They were very loose. It was almost as if they were chasing the game at times. They had a couple of glimpses, if you like, and that seemed to embolden them to play in a more expansive way when they really didn't need to, and that gave Juanmi that opportunity where he scuffed wide. He didn't have a good night at all. Juanmi obviously had that one-on-one with De Gea, which De Gea saved in the first half, and he had another decent opportunity in the second. The death knell for Betis was the failure to score in the first half, and you could just sense a different mood, a different atmosphere in the second half. In the first half, the fans were very fervent. They were very optimistic. They were singing "Si se puede," I think it was, which is "Yes, we can." Ultimately, no, they couldn't, because, as I said, it was absolutely imperative for them to at least get one goal, at least be 1-0 up at half time to give them any remote chance. And the failure to do that, I think that just drained them of all confidence. And it wasn't a coincidence. In the first 10 minutes of the second half, United had two excellent opportunities for Rashford. He was, the first one, very, very tame. The second one, I think he did overcompensate for it, because he put it nearer the Plaza de España than the goal. And then with the one which is barely a chance, not really a chance for most forwards at the moment, but it is a chance for him. He buried it. It was a terrific strike, and a measure of his resilience as well, that in such a short space of time, after wasting two very good opportunities and really not playing very well up until he scored, he still scores a terrific goal, and that did it, really. And it was easy for United to just meander through the rest of the match. Key players came off, some players came on and got some minutes. Those who haven't had minutes were able to stay on and get 90 minutes under their belt. So it went all according to plan after those, as I said, those first frantic 15 minutes where they did seem to be, from United's perspective anyway, they were a little bit too chaotic, and also the atmosphere seemed to throw them off kilter a little bit.
Yeah, it did feel like that midfield was overrun / non-existent in the first half. It was a basketball match, I think, for a lot of the first half, when it probably didn't need to be for United. There wasn't a lot of control until they scored, really. It was noticeable afterwards that players talking about a professional performance, which I guess it was in the end. They survived that early onslaught, but more by luck than judgment at times. In terms of sort of the standout performers, we'll start with someone who maybe wasn't the best player on the pitch, but it might have been the biggest night for in Facundo Pellistri, finally getting that first United start 193 days after he'd signed for the club. I mean, what do you make of his performance? It feels like he's one of the few wingers in this squad who can offer something different. He's a bit of a throwback, really. You can also almost imagine him at home in Fergie's kind of 4-4-2 teams, being a right-footed right winger who just tears down the touchline and to the byline and uses his pace to get beyond defenders, doesn't he?
And you can't underestimate that quality, even in an era where it's about inverted wingers. You do need that variety. And unfortunately for him, at the start, he had a decent opportunity where he went on a good run. He was onside, and call it early, the adrenaline rush, or not necessarily nerves, but probably more just the being a bit adrenaline charged. And he overhit the cross by quite a way, when he probably should have found Weghorst, or at least given Weghorst half a chance by playing a better ball in. He had a couple of dashes early on. Rashford should have played him in. It was the timing of the run was perfect from Pellistri. We had a very lofty vantage point, and you can tell in most cases whether a player's onside or not, and he was. But unfortunately, Rashford overhit it. The booking he got was one of the strangest and most egregious that's ever been handed out by a referee. So it wasn't much of a first half where there was a lot to write home from his part, but he started the second half quite brightly. He contributed to that first opportunity for Rashford, and it was the first time he played 90 minutes in a club game in nearly 2 years. I think he played 90 minutes for Alaves against Atletico Madrid in March 2021. He didn't play 90 minutes once for Alaves while he was on loan there for the entirety of last season. So it was probably a surprise that he did manage to see out the entire game, because he's not had many matches where he's played 90 minutes. Even for Uruguay, I'm not sure that he's completed a full game for them yet, having made his debut in January of last year. But he's clearly got a lot to offer. It was a satisfying night for him. A couple of us spoke to him in the mix zone afterwards, and he's a very likeable lad. He's very polite, speaks good English. What I've been impressed about him more so than his contributions when he's come on in those 6 cameos, is just his attitude. He's clearly got a very good attitude for someone who's had to wait as long as he has to make his United debut, and then to make his full United debut, and to perform at a pretty acceptable level in some cases, and exceed expectations in other cases. Shows that he's a good lad, and United have got a good professional there, and he is an asset. It remains to be seen what they'll do with him going forward. He's been penciled in for a loan move next season. Things can obviously change. At the moment, he's likely to have more opportunities because Garnacho's going to be injured until April at the earliest. I'm not necessarily sure, going off Ten Hag's tone and the tone of Garnacho's post the other day, that means he's going to be back for Newcastle away on April the 2nd, so it might be a fair way down the line until he's available for United again. It's unclear if Anthony will be available for the weekend, so all of a sudden Pellistri's in contention to make his full domestic debut as well, which is positive for him, given that I think in December his agent was certainly itching to get him out of United and to get him on loan in January, because he hadn't had a kick in the first half of the season. But really, since that behind closed doors friendly against Everton in December, where Ten Hag, I think it was unprompted as well, he mentioned how well he had performed in it. He's very gradually got more opportunities. I think he wasn't even in the League Cup final squad because he was injured. There was an injury that he had that hadn't been reported by United, but he told us, myself and Simon Peach last night, that unfortunately recently he had an injury, so I presume it was during that period. He's ahead of Anthony Elanga in the pecking order as well, so he's a certainty to be at least on the bench on Sunday, but there's probably an outside chance of him getting a start. But I suspect, given that was his first 90 minutes in nearly 2 years, it's a bit of a stretch for him to play another 90 minutes in a cup tie where there's a hell of a lot more at stake, and Fulham have obviously had a very good season as well.
Yeah, I hadn't realised it had been so long actually since he completed 90 minutes. There was one moment in the second half when he was involved in creating that first chance, I think it was, for Rashford on the break, when he played it into Fernandes and Fernandes played it into Rashford, where he went shoulder to shoulder with a Sevilla defender, and it was a Sevilla defender that ended up on his backside, and it was an eye-catching moment in a way, because you don't associate that kind of strength and physical conditioning with Pellistri. He's very slight, and that did suggest that he might have what it takes to thrive in the English game. And if he does go on loan next year, he probably needs a Premier League or maybe even a Championship loan if he's going to have any chance of making it at United. Like you say, I think he's clearly above Elanga in the pecking order at the moment. Before we get on to Rashford, did anyone else really catch your eye? I thought it was not a populist opinion, but I thought it was a good night for Harry Maguire. He was pretty solid, pretty secure at the back after maybe a bit of a shaky start. De Gea as well, secure in everything he did. I thought his positioning in terms of sweeping up behind a pretty high line was good. He was off his line quickly to deal with a couple of balls over the top, and that did look like a target for Betis to try and get in behind, but De Gea beat them to it on a couple of occasions. Did anyone else really stand out for you?
I mean, De Gea had a couple of dodgy kicks at the start, which was
That's
not great timing
now.
given the Spain squad's come out today. I've not seen if he's in it.
No, I
haven't, can't imagine he is. That's a news push notification, but I don't think it's telling me whether David De Gea is in the Spain squad or not. But again, you kind of saw the best and worst for him in that his kicking is. I mean, you expect it to be the way it is, but when it mattered most, actually keeping the ball out the back of the net, he did do that. It was a relatively routine save for him. He's not in the Spain squad. I hope I'm looking. Oh no, that's the under-21 squad. So he's definitely not going to be in that. I'm trying to quickly scroll.
Producer Sam is telling us he's not in the squad. So
he's not.
Producer
Brilliant.
Sam says not in the squad.
Sam. Yeah, that's not a surprise.
No, definitely not. And I guess the star of the night again is Marcus Rashford. It's in a way, I said this last night, it felt peak Rashford that he missed the two easier chances and then just thrashes one in nonchalantly from 25 yards with a bit of dip, a bit of swerve to go right in the corner. That's probably a bit unfair, really, given how good his finishing has been this season. 27 goals now, but you know, he was the one name on that team sheet that it really surprised me he was starting, given Sancho was on the bench and been involved in 43 successive games now for United. There's 5 games in the World Cup. Ten Hag is taking a bit of a risk with him, I think, in playing him so often, but he's producing the goods at the moment. So you have to say he's handling him pretty well, and it was a fantastic goal, wasn't it?
Oh, it was. He's got that in his locker. I mean, there was a criticism of him not long ago that he would hit every shot that way. It would always be on the laces, or he would try and opt for that Ronaldo technique, and he's not done that this season. He has mixed it up a hell of a lot with, I mean, the volume of his goals is well known now. He's got 27 goals, 30 goals for club and country this season, but there's been real good variety about the way he scored them. He scored a couple of cracking headers. I think he scored nearly as many headers this season as he has in the entirety of his career. I think it's if he gets one more header than he will have done. And it's difficult, really, as a journalist afterwards when Rashford is the match winner. Like, what more can you say? I mean, the way to take it on now is, and we know what the answer will be from Ten Hag, is it's about emulating Robin van Persie. He was the last United player to score 30 goals in a season. That was 10 seasons ago. I think, bar a cruel intervention, Rashford will do that. I mean, Ibrahimovic probably would have done it in 2016-17 had he not ruptured his anterior cruciate ligament in that, I think it was the quarterfinal against Anderlecht in the Europa League. He did it, and Marcus Rojo sustained the exact same injury on the same night. So with Rashford, there's not a lot more to say at the moment. He's been so good. That's the compliment, really. We've given him all these superlatives, and they've all been entirely deserved. I think he has to be a shoo-in for the Premier League team of the season. You'd think it would be Haaland up front, Rashford on the left, Saka on the right, probably Martin Odegaard as the number 10. I think that's a pretty fair front four if it comes to that, and a pretty good front four as well. So, yeah, with Rashford, I mean, I marked him as 7 because he scored the winning goal, and it was a great winning goal. But up until then, he was probably a 5 out of 10. I thought, as you said, Maguire did well, and we can't be worried about what a certain demographic think of Harry Maguire. If he plays well, you say it, and you make that apparent. And he did play well. Martinez played well. I thought the two centre backs were pretty good in general. Defended well. Those opportunities Sevilla had, the Juanmi one in particular, I think that was a consequence of the midfielders kind of abandoning the United defenders and playing too high a line in those moments and coming a cropper and being a bit too loose. Once they managed that, it was fine. Casemiro didn't start particularly well, but I thought he made his he became more authoritative as the game grew on. Lovely pass for Rashford's goal as well. So it wasn't a night where you came away from a game you were thinking, wow, that player was absolutely amazing, and that's why it was the cliched professional job done by United. A 1-0 away from home in Europe is always a good win, and they had that 3-goal cushion going into the game anyway.
That's all for part one. We will be back after the break to talk about the quarter-final draw and the latest news on the takeover. Welcome back to the Manchester is Red podcast. A unique experience at Erik ten Hag's pre-Fulham press conference today, which was held at Carrington at midday rather than in Seville last night. He came in for the press conference timely, actually, at midday, which was a surprise to us. And during the open section, I think most of us had got a question in. It was just about to end, and we had the unique possibility, our colleague Simon Stone at the BBC had the unique possibility to actually break the quarter-final draw to Ten Hag and get his live reaction, which was interesting. We know they've got Sevilla now in the Europa League. Probably not a lot Ten Hag can say, having just been thrown that information, but the one thing we know about Sevilla in the Europa League is that they often win it. Not having a great season domestically, but that's never stopped them before in Europe. I suppose for United fans, it's a bit of a dull draw in a way. They played Sevilla in the Champions League under Jose Mourinho not so long ago and got knocked out. Obviously, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's team lost in the Europa League to Sevilla, and they've just got back from Seville and Real Betis. But what's your thoughts on the draw and Sevilla in the last 16, and I guess the possibility of Juventus or Sporting in the semi-final as well?
You don't want to look too ahead of ourselves to the semi-final, but obviously the prospect of and also Sporting, who looked really impressive last night against Arsenal from what I saw of it, but the prospect of Pogba and Di Maria coming back to Old Trafford in European semi-final would be something to really witness, given the absolute stick that Di Maria got when he went back with Paris Saint-Germain in 2019. But with Sevilla, normally if you draw them in the Europa League, it's the death knell, because they are the Europa League specialists. They've won it, 5 or 6 times in the last 50. Yeah, and that's come within a 16-year period. I think they won it in 2006 in Glasgow, and in 2006 they beat Middlesbrough in the final, and I think they won it in Glasgow the next year. And since that Middlesbrough win, I think it started in 2006. They've just been known as Europa League specialists, and United, of course, lost to them in the semi-finals in Cologne a few years ago when the Europa League and European competitions were delayed, and then it was these one-off ties in one city because of the pandemic. But I suppose if there is a season to have drawn Sevilla, it's this one, because they're having a poor season. I think they're actually 13th in La Liga. It wasn't long ago that they were in the relegation zone. There seems to be the supporters have turned against Monchi, who's the celebrated director of football, who briefly left, went to Roma and felt like a fish out of water, so he went back to Sevilla, and he's contributed immensely to their success. But it seems like it's come to a point now where they've stagnated, or there's a need for urgent change there. Julen Lopetegui got sacked earlier this season, didn't he? And he was being talked about as potentially taking over at United at one point last season. I don't think anybody truly believed that. With the United manager's role, it was always going to be Pochettino or Ten Hag, but Sevilla have got good pedigree in the Europa League, and I think that's why when West Ham did beat them last season, it's become one of these very immediately celebrated nights in West Ham lore, because not only was it a season where they progressed to the semi-finals of a European competition, but they beat Sevilla, and that was supposed to be, as I said, the death knell for most clubs when you come across Sevilla in this competition. So United, as I said, I think it's the right time to draw. If you're to draw Sevilla in the Europa League, this is the season to do it. And I suppose if you're talking about Monchi's recruitment hit rate, taking Alex Telles on loan is quite questionable. He should be eligible to play against United as well, given that Diogo Dalot played against United for AC Milan a couple of years ago. But Isco went back to Sevilla at the start of the season, and his contract was terminated a couple of months ago. So that gives you an idea of some of the strife that they've encountered there. but it's a hell of a stadium. I mean, when United drew 0-0 there 5 years ago, it was not a particularly memorable game whatsoever. It was memorable only for that save from David De Gea, one of his greatest. But the stadium was extremely atmospheric, very similar to the Betis stadium last night, which was quite the sight to behold. Pre-match, walking to the ground with the supporters, and one guy had a megaphone, the other guy had a drum, which I don't want inside a stadium, but outside a stadium, I think that's perfectly. I'm prepared to make an allowance for that. But I thought the Sevilla atmosphere 5 years ago was one of the best that I've experienced. So, given that their season will hinge on winning the Europa League, and of course, if you win the Europa League, it's been even more incentivised now, because victory in the Europa League means you're not only going into the Champions League, you're going into the Champions League as a top seed. So you certainly can't underestimate Sevilla just because of their pedigree in the competition, and their season very much does depend on doing well in the Europa League.
Yeah, and United have gone out to Spanish opposition 5 years in a row, I think, now in Europe. So there's always that
still
nervous
stands.
element.
That possibility
I guess
is still there.
That still goes. Yeah. And then the sixth different Spanish opposition they've faced in the last 2 years, and fourth this season. But beyond Atletico Madrid, they've not really had too much trouble with any of them. And the way they've beaten Barcelona and Real Betis this season, when you look at Sevilla in 13th, and maybe they're improving a little under Sampaoli, but it's not, they're not making huge strides. The only real concern, like you say, is that Europa League pedigree, and maybe it's almost like Real Madrid in the Champions League, and that's the one thing that makes you nervous, that something slightly magical happens to them in the Europa League. But I think United will certainly be strong favourites, and like you say, the possibility of that Juventus semi-final is mouth-watering. The other noticeable thing at the press conference today was partly the timing of it, that we arrived at Carrington at pretty much the same time as Sir Jim Ratcliffe. A few of us were quickly corralled back inside the main reception when we tried to step outside and have a look for the convoy, the Ineos convoy, including Sir Dave Brailsford arriving at Carrington. We did see a couple of blacked out people carriers arriving at Carrington, and we were quickly even shoved away from the window and not allowed to take photos. So it was very much a lockdown operation, keeping us well away from any of the Ineos people. But the first question to Ten Hag in his press conference was about the takeover and Ratcliffe being there, and he did say he'd just met him and had shaken hands and had a brief hello with him, really, which I think surprised everyone. I think we all thought he would play the possibility down. It's obviously been a big week for the potential takeover, with Sheikh Dazim and the Qatar delegation representing him, at least yesterday, being at Old Trafford and Carrington. I mean, how do you sort of see the picture at the moment in regards to the takeover and what is happening at the moment? Because it does feel like it's been a significant week, doesn't it, for it?
It does, and it feels like there's almost not an even split, but there's a split in that you've got Sheikh Hassim, who was not present for these discussions on Thursday, but with the online community, if you can call them that, he is very ardently backed, because that's the way it goes these days. I mean, Manchester United appeal to so many supporters, so many followers of football around the world, and Qatar is this up and coming force in football, if you like. The Qatari national team aren't a force, but Qatar as a nation has got involved in football through Paris Saint-Germain. It wants to become more involved in football. It's just hosted the World Cup. That's emboldened them to take another step, and Manchester United are one of the biggest sporting institutions on the planet. So that's the appeal of it is immense, and also the statement that confirmed Sheikh Hassim's interest in buying United, stressed that it would be a debt-free takeover, which is also going to appeal to a lot of supporters who, since the takeover happened by the Glazed family in 2005, the debt has been more than just a bugbear. It's something that has certainly hampered United at times, even though they have spent. I mean, Richard Arnold said himself during his pub talk session in Cheshire last year that they've burned through £1 billion in cash because they didn't spend wisely in the transfer market. So I think a lot of overseas supporters obviously going to be supportive of Sheikh Hassim. Then you have Sir Jim Ratcliffe, who was born in Greater Manchester. He has been on site today. There's a brilliantly framed photograph of him taken by Eamon Clark with the East Stand exterior in the background, and I think his hand is quite near the Sir Matt Busby statue, and you've got the neon red Manchester United words above it. He must have known what he was doing, Ratcliffe, when he was making that walk. And he's obviously been filmed, pictured today meeting Richard Arnold, the chief executive, Colette Roach, who's the chief operating officer. There were a couple of other faces that you and I will recognise just from going to games in Old Trafford and going to games specifically in a press capacity. You see certain faces walking along, stadium managers, don't know them by name, but we see them a lot. They see us a lot, and you recognise the face, and those people have been chaperoning Ratcliffe as well today. And because Ratcliffe is a local man, that is going to appeal to the match goers, and that's an important distinction. The match goers invest financially in Manchester United. They are paying season ticket prices. A lot of them will be buying merchandise in the club shop. They will have kids who want kits. They'll have kids who want God knows what else you can buy in the megastore these days, but I can imagine there's a lot of regalia. There'll be, I don't know, dog bowls in there, God knows what. And that's going to appeal to people who can access that. You can obviously buy it online as well, but if you can be there present, you're likely to spend more money. And I think that's something that people have to realise, where it's not a discrepancy as such, but that's why it's the split is there, in that match-going United supporters, whether they're 40 years old, 50 years old, 30 years old, 70 years old, however, whatever their age, they are probably going to be, more inclined to hope that a chap who was born in Greater Manchester and who's been on site today takes charge of the club. It's that local element to it, whereas Sheikh Hassim is very international, and there's a very international fan base that Manchester United have, and a large portion of that would be in favour of Sheikh Hassim as well. And I think what came out from Sheikh Hassim's statement last month, it was impressive. It ticked a lot of the boxes. It sounded great. So that is going to appeal to a lot of fans domestically and also internationally. Whereas with Ratcliffe, I mean, it's interesting in a way, because when Ratcliffe, before the announcement came out in November from the Glazer family that they were open to a sale, Ratcliffe was seen as the panacea, and I think every United fan was behind the prospect of him being the owner of the club and him taking over. And he'd made it known that he was interested in buying Manchester United as well, and that was fine. As soon as there was external interest, and there's some irony there because Ratcliffe does live in Morocco and he doesn't pay British taxes as well, but I'm talking about obviously Sheikh Hassim here, and there was suggestions that there might have been Saudi interest. Since that became concrete and that was confirmed last month, there's been a hell of a lot of support for Qatari involvement in United. And I think the World Cup has helped that as well, because for 4 weeks, Qatar was the epicenter of the universe. All eyes were on it because it hosted some tremendous football matches and probably the best World Cup final ever. So it was a great advertisement for Qatar as a footballing entity, and now they want to branch out with Manchester United. So we can go on about it all day, why people are in favour of Sir Jim Ratcliffe, why others are in favour of Sheikh Hassim, but it does feel like there's a more defined split now, even though there are a lot of nuances to it, as we've discussed before, as I've written before, as a well-know. With Qatar, it's sports washing, as it was with Abu Dhabi and City, as it was with QSI and PSG, as it was with the takeover of Newcastle United last season. And yes, with Sir Jim Ratcliffe, he voted for Brexit. A lot of people will not like that. He was knighted and then he moved to Monaco to avoid paying British taxes. He won't like that. A lot of United fans won't like the fact that he bid for Chelsea. last year. A lot of United fans will say, well, if he's such a United fan, why did he have a Chelsea season ticket? Others won't take kindly to, because he's obviously the owner of Ineos, which is petrochemicals, fracking. So there's a greenwashing element to it as well. So, however, wherever your moral compass points, there are aspects of both potential buyers that are going to be unappealing to certain people, but people have different, as I said, people have different morals, different principles, and different preferences. So whoever comes in, not everyone is going to be happy. And ultimately, as we've seen with other football clubs, if there is a new owner, as long as the team are winning, more often than not, that does make supporters sanguine with the ownership. And that definitely has been the case at times under the Glazer family. It hasn't always been the sustained protesting since 2005, when Manchester United were winning the Premier League 3 years on the trot between 2007 to 2009 and won the European Cup in 2008. There were next to no protests against the Glazer family. The first real protests after the takeover in 2005 was started with the green and gold movement at the start of 2010. But it has obviously over the last year, maybe the last few years, in fact, it's felt like there's been a more vocal presence making themselves heard about their opposition to the Glazers.
Yeah, and the fact is, good luck finding a multi-billionaire who isn't morally dubious in one way or another.
Yeah.
That's all for this part of the podcast. We will be back in a minute to talk about the Fulham game this weekend. Welcome back to the Manchester is Red podcast. There is one more game to go before the international break, and this relentless stretch of the season between the World Cup and the March internationals is finally at an end. And me and Samuel can put our feet up, as can some of the United players who aren't going away on internationals. We were talking about this at the presser today, but it's 12 successive midweek games for United now. I think it's going to be 16 in the end if you don't count the international break, or at least 16. It could well go beyond that if they keep going in Europe. I guess it's what you get when you're successful, and they are winning every cup match at the moment. It's a guarantee of at least 60 games a season now, and you would think by Sunday night that'd be 61. Fulham at home, of course, in the FA Cup quarter-final. United, I think, 21 undefeated now at Old Trafford, 22 undefeated maybe. It's a great home record, and as good as Fulham are doing it, it should be a home win. I guess the big talking point going into it is, what are United going to do about not having Casemiro for 4 successive domestic games now? I did ask Ten Hag about that at the press conference. As one of our colleagues has suggested, it was my do your research moment. It wasn't quite that brutal, but he did.
He didn't say do your research.
He didn't say do your research. No, it was suggested.
No.
Suggested his eyes said it, but I had my head down. I was trying not to look at him because I could sense he wasn't best pleased. But as much as he disputed it and suggested United have played very well without Casemiro, they have also struggled immensely without him at times, and it's clear he performs a function in this team that a lot of others, that anyone else really can't do. So how do you go about replacing him in this team? I guess it's less important. The fixtures are kind in a way, these 4 games, that they're not Arsenal away or Man City away or Man City at home. But is it simply a case of bringing in Scott McTominay and playing the same way, or do you have to change more than that because Casemiro is so unique?
I wouldn't have thought McTominay will come in. I think he's very much the 5th choice midfielder now, and the fact that Sabitzer came on ahead of him for the second half, not the entire second half from Betis, but he came on. Was it for Fernandes? I think it might have been, or for Fred. But that seemed to indicate that he will start the weekend, and he started. This is a bit obviously. He started 3 times with Fred already. I think McTominay's last start against West Ham, he came off at half time because it just wasn't working, and they needed to make a change there. Or Ten Hag certainly felt that they needed to. And also, you can't underestimate the Fulham midfield. I mean, Ten Hag underestimated Southampton's midfield last week, which I found quite peculiar in that he only started one outright central midfielder in Casemiro when you come up against Ward-Prowse and Romeo Lavia, who looks a really, really good player and really should be playing in the Premier League next season if Southampton do go down. And you look at Fulham's midfield, Harrison Reed's had a pretty solid season, and he's done well for himself, given that he was one of those Southampton products who didn't quite make it at Southampton when a lot of their standout academy players were getting into the first team, but he's clearly good enough at Premier League level. And there's also I forget his name now, the Portuguese midfielder who scored a cracker against João Palhinha, who scored against Leeds in the last round, who's having a really good season as well, and has already been talked up. There's speculation that he might be on the move in the summer to bigger and possibly better things. So I think it'd be remiss of Ten Hag to underestimate that, and I don't think he will do after how it went against Southampton last week. I think it will be Fred and Sabitzer, which has been a work in progress. Ten Hag said at one of his press conferences last month about the challenge of integrating a player into the team in a month where the games are coming thick and fast, and there's a lot of jeopardy attached to those games because, last month there were two. There was the doubleheader against Barcelona, of course. There was the League Cup final. Did they play? I can't remember. West Ham, I think, was at the start of March. But in the league, there was still a little bit of tentative talk by some that maybe United could come up with a title challenge, and they found themselves 2-0 down at home to Leeds in Sabitzer's first start. And he's not started many games since Casemiro came back from that 3-match suspension for getting sent off against Crystal Palace. I think it was only the West Ham Cup game he did start in. But of course now he's absolutely needed, and Christian Eriksen isn't going to be back until late April. So there's the prospect of not just starting this weekend for Sabitzer, but also starting in 3 domestic matches next month, which I think would be against Newcastle away, Brentford at home and Everton at home. So it's an opportunity for him to stake his claim. But more importantly and more immediately, they've got to get through a pretty, possibly a tricky cup tie against Fulham. I know Fulham have had a couple of bad results recently, and maybe, they're going to be in the Premier League next season. They've exceeded expectations to be in the position they're in the Premier League and to be in the FA Cup quarter-finals. Marco Silva has been one of the unexpected success stories of the season, given how all right it went at his previous 3 Premier League clubs. He went down with Hull. Watford sacked him because Everton wanted him, and then when Everton finally got him, they didn't really show much faith in him and sacked him, I think, just before Christmas, and that was in 2019. So he was probably a little bit lucky to get a plum championship job in Fulham, but he has had a terrific effect there, getting them promoted as well as they did last season. And the challenge for them has always been, can they stay in the Premier League? They've always invested heavily, but they've not quite got the balance right. But this season they clearly have, and a lot of credit has to go to Silva for that. So it's one of those matches that is, I think there's the cliched banana skin element of it, as people are prone to say in the FA Cup. But given the quality that United have still got available, and Ten Hag certainly signposted some of the recalls in midweek. Shaw and Varane will come back in. Rashford came off in the second half. Martinez came off in the second half. Fernandes came off in the second half. They will all start, obviously. You might see Dalot come back in because I thought Wan-Bissaka was very, very limited in Seville. So United have got more than enough quality to win that game, even though they found it pretty tough going against Fulham back in November. They played pretty well in the first half, but weren't ruthless enough, and then they almost ended up drawing the game, but for that late Garnacho goal. So there's the possibility of extra time as well. They won't have as many game changers on the bench with Garnacho injured. Obviously, Anthony, it remains to be seen if he'll be fit again after his illness in the week. I don't think he trains today. Looking at the images that the rights holders were able to get. And it sounds like Marshall might not even be risked either on Sunday. So they would be lacking attacking options off the bench. And this is a game that could go to 120 minutes. So it'll be interesting to see how well drilled United are, given that there is one in particular key enforced change, and their record without Casemiro since he came into the team. I think he can dismiss the early season wins. Well, against Liverpool, he couldn't play. The Arsenal game, Ten Hag had established quite a settled side when they beat them in September. The more relevant games where Casemiro hasn't played in are obviously the defeat to Arsenal, where United did get battered. That the scoreline wasn't entirely a fair reflection of the dominance Arsenal enjoyed that day. They were 2-0 down against Leeds United, and they needed a goal, quite a late goal. I think they went 1-0 up against Leeds at Ellen Road in the 80th minute. So, and also the midfield duo across these games where Casemiro hasn't been playing in, they've not particularly performed. I think Sabitzer's best impacts have been off the bench. Sabitzer and Fred as a starting duo, they've not, I think in those three games, I don't think they've really shone necessarily. And that's understandable because one of them only came in January and he's only a loan signing. So for United's sake, they have to hope that there's a better understanding in this game on Sunday.
Yeah, you mentioned Martial there. I think Ten Hag has said he won't be involved. He's clearly being handled very delicately. I think been back in training for about 10 days now, but not featured in any games. So clearly not risking him given his injury record this year. I mean, one Fulham player I guess is worth touching on a bit more is Andreas Pereira, who didn't really create many headlines when he left United last summer. The only player they managed to sell, got £10 million for him, which perhaps looks a little undervalued now given how well he's done to Fulham. And I think we all thought at the time it was probably a bit of a strange one, given he'd not made much impact in the Premier League at United. That sensational goal against Southampton aside, probably. But done really well at Fulham, 3 goals and 6 assists in 31 games. Ten Hag was asked about him today and talked about working with him at PSV Eindhoven in the youth system there as well. Someone he clearly knows a little bit, but was happy to sanction that sale in the summer, and did kind of make the point that sometimes when you're at a club as big as United, sometimes you've got to go away and go to a smaller environment to find your feet and get your opportunities. And Pereira has done that and grasped that, and playing in that advanced role for Fulham and linking up well with Mitrovic. He is someone that is going to be a threat to United back at Old Trafford this weekend, isn't he?
Yeah, I remember during the 2019-20 season, I spoke to someone who knows him quite well, and they said if you notice his best performances, talking about that season, I think he listed Liverpool at home, Norwich away, and I'm stretching my memory here, Brighton at home. And he said, what do you notice about those 3 games? And I said, he's playing as number 10. He said, exactly. He said that Pereira was a victim of his own selflessness, in that when he first got into the team properly under Mourinho, he was playing as a deep line midfielder, almost a defensive midfielder, because United didn't have any other options. It had been a World Cup year in 2018. He'd done very well in pre-season, and he was actually advised to say to Mourinho, no, I'm not playing there, but this was an opportunity of a lifetime. It was to cement your place in the United first team. He did quite well in the first game against Leicester, second game against Brighton. United 3-1 down at half-time. He's taken off. And United never really used him in the right role, but I would always argue that he was never truly good enough to be Manchester United's number 10. He did do well there a few times, but the death knell for his United career was when Fernandes came in. As soon as they signed Fernandes, I'm not necessarily sure Pereira even started for the club again or in a meaningful game. It's difficult to recall, or in that position as the number 10. They just bought a massive upgrade in Fernandes, and his loan spells were pretty underwhelming. His best loan spell was possibly was it at Granada under Tony Adams came in 2016, 2016-17 season, and although he did quite well at Flamengo, I think he made a mistake in a cup game there, and that scuppered a move there, and it looked like he was going to move to Flamengo permanently. So I think there was some surprise that he he got the move to Fulham, and let's face it, there's an agent, Kia Jarabchin, who is very influential in Fulham's transfer policy. Willian's gone there, Cedric Suarez has gone there. I think he's had a hand in Pereira going there as well. And fortunately for Fulham, it's worked out, and he has pretty much religiously played as their number 10. And Ten Hag is right. There are certain players who you see the ability and it's excellent. It's looking good, but then you put them in that pressure cooker environment at United and it can be too hot for them, and they can get suffocated amid the scrutiny and the demands and the expectation. It's very much, as important as the ability side is in football, the psychological aspect is absolutely huge as well. And that's why someone like, as an example, Scott McTominay is not as good a footballer as Andres Pereira, I would argue, but he's been able to handle the mental side better than him. And that's the way it works sometimes. But to be playing regularly in the Premier League for a club who are comfortably in the top 10 this season indicates that Pereira's a good footballer, and it obviously helps immensely that he's playing at a club where there's not much pressure. If Fulham had finished 17th this season, that would have been a success for them. They're probably going to finish in the top 10, and to have got to the FA Cup quarterfinals at the very least, they've had an excellent season irrespective of what happens between now and the end of the season.
Yeah, and there's certainly no regrets at Old Trafford about selling Pereira, but hopefully he won't be the story this weekend. That's everything for today's podcast. Thanks for your contribution, Samuel, and get to bed after your early morning flight back from Spain.
Oh, it wasn't too early, fortunately. It wasn't as early as Barcelona. That was the 3 a.m. alarm blaring off, yeah. But it was a 3 a.m. start on Wednesday, so I'm sure everyone's playing violins for me. But, no, it's obviously a privilege doing these trips and doing
absolutely. Yeah, that's all for today's episode. We'll be back on Monday to discuss the Fulham game and look ahead to the international break and the chance of rest. Please give us a like and subscribe. And a reminder, you can also watch this podcast now on YouTube and subscribe to our YouTube channel for plenty more content such as that. And we'll be back and see you on Monday.